3:20 p.m. on the 27th of December 2016. I learned of the passing of actress Carrie Fisher at approximately 1:23 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, as did the rest of the world. During these 2 hours, the outpouring of support across social media has been tremendous. Carrie was truly loved the world over for her craft and her ardent support of mental health disorders, and her tireless efforts to promote awareness and bring these debilitating conditions to light. She was more than Hollywood royalty. She was a beautiful soul that has battled her own demons. But this is not about Carrie Fisher. She may have acted as a catalyst behind it, but she was not the inspiration. 2016 has been a challenging year for children of my generation. We're around about the age of 30, and our heroes are getting on in years. We're beginning to come to grips with mortality in a way that we never have before, thanks in large part to our always-on, always-connected society. I was fortunate enough to have the news of Carrie Fisher's death told to me by a friend and not my social media news feed, or, forbid, a push notification to my smartphone, like some of my friends. We rushed to share and repost, tagging a tabloid or instant obituary with our own 2 cents about the departed. And yet, as our childhood heroes begin to pass in greater and greater numbers, something that will eventually befall us all, this concept of death and mourning is still fresh, painful territory for most of us. The oversaturation of violent media and beloved fictional characters meeting brutal ends week after week has done little to prepare us for processing actual loss. American society does not know how to grieve. We shun the negative. We medicate the depressed. We caffeinate the sleepy and tranquilize the rest. Outside of happiness and pride, our own emotions are unpredictable outliers to be feared and ignored. Even the natural process of grief has been monetized and removed from all but those brave enough to come face to face with mortality. The closest we get to our own mortal eventuality is an editorial obituary covered with clickbait ads stuffed strategically in our news feeds. So we click, we read, we repost with a sentence or two about it being a damn shame, and we carry on with our days. We've reduced the stages of grief from 7 to share, and we only have ourselves to blame. My earliest memory of death comes from the funeral of my great-grandmother Vera. I was a quiet 4-year-old that didn't understand what was happening, and I sat at the back of the room with my mother, glancing around at the collection of weeping mourners, family and friends, the man in white talking softly about God and heaven, and the half-open wooden box at the front of the room with a tuft of white hair and hands clasped as if in prayer sticking up over the top. The actual events may vary, as this is simply what my 32-year-old self can remember of a 4-year-old's first funeral, and they may or may not be accurate. But I recall asking my mother, or maybe I just thought I did, why her hands were clasped like that. And her response included something along the lines of her version of Christianity being different from ours, so they prayed differently. I don't remember looking into the casket after the service, but I'm sure that I did. As my 4-year-old self still didn't understand, it's not all that important. This was death, without context. It was just another day, except everyone was sad. A few years later, my other great-grandmother, Madge, passed away. I remember this death a bit more clearly, but still being a child of 6 or 7, it may not be entirely accurate. It was at the same funeral parlor. The same plastic green carpeting lining the steps, the same room with the same arrangement of chairs and the same half-open wooden box. This time, with my sisters beside me, we viewed her body before the service started. I noted the strange makeup that gave her cheeks more color than they ever had when she was alive. I remember some sort of floral pattern, or perhaps it was just the flowers, and I distinctly remember her glasses were in the casket with her. Whether or not I asked my mother about it, I couldn't say, but it struck me as strange. I understood death more at 6 than I did at 4, and I knew that she couldn't possibly need them. But that, like most things, I just kept to myself. The difference between viewing my Grandma Madge from my Grandma Vera was that I touched her skin. And she was cold, very cold. Not like a winter's day or an ice cube sense of cold, but the kind of cold that signifies permanence. Very deep water, where the sun never touches. That sinking in your stomach when a loved one says, "We need to talk." The type of cold I can remember on my skin over a quarter century after we put her body in the ground. The second difference between Vera and Madge was getting wrapped up in the emotional conclusion of the service. I remember walking out the door of the funeral home with my sisters, all crying into my mom's dress, not necessarily because we were sad or that we missed my great-grandmother or even understood what the funeral service represented, but that the air was heavy. Adults of all ages were openly crying around us, and being kids, we may not have understood it, but we saw that this is what people are supposed to do when somebody dies. The final difference was attending the burial that followed the service, an element I didn't wholly observe, but I wish I had in a way. I remember the hole in the earth, a pile of loose dirt covered by a green tarp, and the strain on the face of my father as the other pallbearers swiftly moved the glistening wooden casket from the hearse to the hole. And I remember another male relative with a pocket knife picking moss from the headstone, digging furiously into the W in William for my great-grandfather that died decades before, muttering under his breath about nobody caring enough to maintain the stone. Cousins around my age ran between the stones playing freely, and I would ultimately join them. But my final memory of the burial comes from before the service began. One of my cousins had caught a grasshopper, and my childhood fascination with the insect had me excited about it. I remember how carefully he kept that creature contained within his palms, like a delicate secret he longed to preserve. I wanted to hold the grasshopper, for myself, but he refused. He had grander plans. So I observed. Carefully, deliberately, he approached the burial site where the casket now lay. He bent at the waist and tossed the little grasshopper into the open grave. My eyes opened wide and my jaw dropped as the innocent little insect disappeared into the shadow below. Beaming with a sense of pride over his act of insecticide, he ran back into the cemetery to look for another grasshopper, but my mind was struggling to justify the actions I had just observed. Why did he do that? What had the grasshopper done? Was it going to escape the grave or be buried underneath my great-grandmother's casket, sealed into the crypt 6 feet below? And I remember feeling upset. And that's where my memories of the service end. I say these things because in the few instances I've had to cope with the loss of a family member or friend since those early days, I find that I can't. Whether through social or media manipulation of my gender, the need to be stoic and strong for everybody else, or some other mental barrier I installed long ago, I've been unable to mourn any loss to the extent that I would deem necessary or even acceptable. With each new loss, I found it easier to disconnect emotionally. Even the loss of my paternal grandparents, arguably my favorite people in the world, saw me sitting through funeral services feeling the want and desire to let these feelings out, to ease the pain in my chest and share in the grieving of my collective tribe, but not a tear was shed. Not then, not ever. And this lack of mourning leaves me in an irrational mindset where I believe my grandparents are still alive and puttering around their house as if they never left, and I can show up any time. Now, I know it's not true, and I know it's irrational, but having never mourned, I have no physical proof to see that they're gone. In recent years, as celebrities I've admired have died, I've used several of their deaths as socially acceptable ways of expressing grief. Bowie, Lemmy, George Michael, Carrie Fisher. The endless onslaught that 2016 has brought to my generation has been a good exercise in inevitability. But even now, as I try to come to terms with mortality and learn how to mourn loss for the first time in my life, I'm presented by the arguments that shut me down in the first place. Reminders that mourning a celebrity is silly, that the older we get, the more loss we will encounter, so don't feel like one loss is any more important than another. Because everyone dies. Ashes to ashes, funk to funky. The guilt behind our grief is that constant reminder to ignore our negative emotions. The argument that has rendered me an emotionally sterile fortress, unable to cry, unable to grieve, unable to express the pain in my heart that reminds us that we are alive. Now, I've gotten better at getting worse. I'm feeling these losses where I should I would not have felt them before. I haven't cried for them, and I doubt I will. I will miss all the artists taken too soon in 2016 and beyond. If I can take solace in the shared grief in their passing by sharing a few sentences on a social media page, I'm going to do it. Because someday it won't be another celebrity. It will be a friend or a family member. And as much as I pray that day will never come for any of them, I know that it's foolish to think, and one of the many bricks I used in the wall that separated me from my emotions all those years ago. When that day comes, I want to be ready. I want to have wet eyes and an open heart. I want to feel that grief. I don't want to be disconnected from my humanity. If we will go out of our way to ensure that a family pet can see their master one last time, then we need to stop shutting ourselves out from our own hearts. Whether it's Carrie Fisher, a fictional character on a well-regarded TV show, a grandparent or a friend, don't feel ashamed to embrace those feelings of loss. We learn to ride a bike by falling off repeatedly. We learn about the fragility and beauty of life by mourning the loss of those around us. We all feel it. It's natural, it's healthy, and it's just as big a part of the meaning of life as sex, love, and being embarrassed by elements of your awkward teenage rebellion. Well, except for me, I was an absolute boss in Jinko jeans, Hot Topic t-shirts, and wearing headphones everywhere. But in closing, I will continue to do what I'm doing. Learning to mourn is making me feel alive. And what is sunshine without the rain but just another boring day? Thank you, Carrie, George, David, Alan, Prince, all that we've lost and loved in 2016 for helping me learn to feel for the first time in my adult life.